It has only been 4 months since this show started. There's two things that motivate Trump: cruelty and corruption.
California does not cower, not now, not ever. We say to police, you can go yourself.
Will you stand up to Donald Trump?
Democratic leaders from across the nation fired up in Anaheim over the weekend as they joined 4,000 California Democrats for the annual state party convention. Today marks 1 year until the state's 2026 primary.
And not present at the California Democratic Convention or the South Carolina Democratic Convention, former Vice President Kamala Harris, who apparently still is considering a run for governor. Politico senior political reporter Melanie Mason exploring the Harris dynamic in her latest piece. It's called Two States, One Tepid View of Kamala Harris and Her Political Future.
Melanie Mason joins us now with more. Melanie, good to have you here. Let's start with the convention itself. Democrats obviously in the driver's seat in California, but there is work to do nationally, a lot of work. What was the general feeling, the vibe in Anaheim this weekend, and how much of it was focused on combating Trump?
I think you had a little bit of both. I mean, certainly there's no better applause line for a group of California Democrats than to go after Donald Trump. And you saw that in that montage, right? There was lots of swear words, cuss words talking about the current president. But I think that the more interesting conversation, and maybe the more urgent one, is what the Democrats should do next. And that was what you heard a lot from Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. He was sort of really challenging the Democratic Party to think, what can the party do to win back some of these working class voters that, quite frankly, moved in Trump's direction in the last election? And so there was definitely a lot of triumphant sort of we hate Trump rhetoric. But I think the more interesting soul searching were Democrats thinking, how do they find themselves back from the wilderness?
Melanie, in your piece and the conversation around former Vice President Harris, both California and South Carolina, you're describing the view of her political future as tepid. What do you mean by that?
I think it means that when I was talking to delegates in California and my colleague Braxton Booker was talking to Democrats in South Carolina, when we asked them, how do you feel about a potential governor run in California, or how do you feel about a potential 2028 run as president, the view was not overly enthusiastic. I don't think that there was necessarily overt hostility to the former vice president. But what I didn't hear, and what Braxton didn't hear in South Carolina, was anybody saying we absolutely want her to run, or more importantly, we absolutely want other Democrats to get out of the way in deference to her. And so I think that what I took away from this is that no matter what path she chooses, if she chooses to seek elected office again, she should not expect that to be a coronation. She's going to have to convince the voters of California, or convince the Democrats nationally, that she's going to earn that nomination. And so I think that, obviously she's the most famous Democrat that there is. She was the most recent Democratic nominee. But this is not necessarily automatically going to be hers to take, depending on which office she wants to pursue.
Yeah, some interesting takes from the Democratic faithful in your piece. Some say the California governor's mansion could be a graceful exit from the national stage. Others say California isn't a consolation prize for the presidency. Another told you they're concerned for Harris's well-being, and they, quote, just want her to rest.
I think what that reflects is that there is still a lot of goodwill for the former vice president in this party, right? And so, look, she went through a bruising loss in 2024 after a really extraordinary run, right? 107-day presidential campaign. I mean, that is unheard of. And so I think what that reflects is a lot of people who said to me and to my colleague, look, whatever she chooses, we want it to be the best choice for her. But I think this dynamic, particularly here in California, I think a lot of people really wonder, has she gotten the sort of desires out of a presidential run out of her system? Is she looking at California as a backup plan? The sentiments that I heard over and over again in Anaheim this weekend from Democrats was California has a lot of issues. It has a lot of problems, and they haven't heard her really talk very much about what she would do, or what these crises that California is facing, how she would approach them. That doesn't mean that she, doesn't have time to explain herself, but I think that that is going to be the main question if she does decide to run, is on things like homelessness or on housing. What does she want to do?
Yeah, you mentioned a backup plan. I don't think anybody or any state wants to be a backup plan. We know
Right.
that self-imposed summer deadline is approaching. So what's your gut? What do you think Harris decides?
Oh, I mean, I think that any political journalist knows that there's no benefit in making a prediction. So I'm not going to do it. But I also think, speaking to the people I know who know the vice president well and are in her circle, I think that there is a genuine sort of debate and decision that's being done. I mean, I think that depending on sort of what hour of the day, the people that I talk to will either say it's more likely she is or it's more likely that she isn't. But the big takeaway I have is that she's thinking very seriously about this, and I think that that means also understanding that this is a big job. This is the fourth largest economy in the world. This is a state that has a lot of muscle on the international stage and also has a lot of problems. So you're not going to casually decide to run for governor one day.
Yeah, well, either she is or she isn't. That's a fair prediction. Noticeably absent this weekend, Governor Newsom, who was in Oregon at a Democratic Governors Association conference. Does that decision mean anything to you?
I think it was noticed by Democrats in the state. And look, he has skipped this state party convention a couple of times now. And I think that, look, as Newsom perhaps contemplates a 2028 presidential run, I think that he's thinking about how does he expand his profile outside of the state of California. Look, California Democrats, they know him pretty well. They know him, they either love her or they hate him, but they have an opinion about him. And I'm sure that what he thinks is more important is trying to figure out how would he expand his visibility, his relatability, and just kind of his attractiveness as a candidate to other states. So maybe being in sort of this siloed off world of California Democrats is not necessarily the best use of his time right now.
Melanie, we've heard the governor say this before, as goes California, so goes the nation. So what do we think? Looking at the convention from over the weekend, what does it tell you about the Democratic mindset and maybe the energy heading into 2026 and then beyond into the presidential race in 2028?
I think in 2026, we probably know what the game plan is, right? With Trump in the White House, the midterm year, Democrats are going to be talking all about Trump, all about the National Republicans and what he is doing. And they think that they have an opportunity to capitalize on some of the unpopular policies that we have seen out of this White House. I think the real question and the real mystery is what comes next in 2028 when there is this open primary, where there is this ability for Democrats to kind of have their own identity conversation. And I have to tell you, I don't think we know yet what direction that conversation is going to go in. But as a reporter, it's the one that I'm more interested in following.
Yeah, and maybe they don't know either. Melanie Mason, good of you to take the time, senior political reporter at Politico. Before we go, a big congratulations in order on your Sacramento Press Club win for Best 2024 Election Reporting. Congratulations. Well deserved.
And thanks for being with us, Melanie.
That's very kind of you. Thank you so much.
Take care. See you down the road.